Even though you can't see me, you know that I'm here talking to you. And I can probably persuade you that this container of water and this container of water have the same amount of water, which they do, even though they don't look like they do. And you'll see I left my anglerfish behind me. If someone were to move it without my knowing, you'd rightly expect me to look for it first where I originally left it. You can figure out all these things because you are far down the path of cognitive development. Your parents will be proud. But there was a time in your life, well, in all our lives, when simple concepts like these were totally baffling. Of course, lots of things influence how your mind and its relationship with the world grows over time. Both our genetics and our environment begin to affect our development long before we're even born, and they continue to influence our learning until the day we die. And even though we're born with nearly the same number of brain cells we'll ever have, our complete set of brain hardware takes years to solidify as our neural networks grow more complex. The study of our physical changes, cognitive, social, and emotional changes throughout our whole lives from prenatal to preteen to post-retirement is called developmental psychology. It's how we grow into who we are. And it begins with the growth of knowledge itself, the process by which you matured into the anglerfish tracking, water beaker estimating, peekaboo master that you are today. As we age, we tend to follow a sequence of changes in behavior and appearance called maturation. Everyone's affected differently by their personal experience, of course, but we all share inherent genetic growth tendencies. We roll over before we sit before we stand, and we stand before we walk, and we walk before we break dance. The same thing applies to our cognitive development, how we learn to think, know, remember, and communicate. And if you're going to talk about cognitive development, you gotta start with Jean Piaget, developmental psychologist extraordinaire. Piaget was from Switzerland, where he was kind of a wonderkind and got his PhD in zoology in 1918, began dabbling in Freud's psychoanalysis. After graduation, he headed to France to work on a method for testing children's aptitudes and abilities. While administering these tests, Piaget began to notice how younger kids kept giving wrong answers to certain questions. He became fascinated by the fact that children of a certain age consistently made particular mistakes that older kids and adults didn't. Like the younger kids would have a really hard time understanding that idea I just showed you, that this container has the same amount of water in it as this container, or that this row of coins has the same number as this row. While others might have dismissed these as childish mistakes, Piaget theorized that it was because humans go through specific stages of cognitive development and intellectual progression.
So today, with Piaget's help, we're going to do Module 47, Infancy and Childhood, Cognitive Development. So somewhere on your little precarious journey from egghood to personhood, you became conscious. And when was that, and how your mind unfolded from there is a question that people have. Developmental psychologist Jean Piaget spent his whole life searching for the answers to questions like that. He studied a child's cognitive development. Cognitive development, or cognition, is all the mental activities associated with thinking and knowing and remembering and communicating. His interest began in 1920 when he was in Paris, developing questions for children's intelligence tests like the video just referred to. He became really intrigued by the children's wrong answers, which were often strikingly similar among same-age children, and where others saw mistakes, Piaget saw intelligence at work. A half a century spent with children convinced Piaget that a child's mind is not a miniature model of an adult's. Thanks partly to his work, we now understand that children reason differently than adults in wildly illogical ways about problems whose solutions are self-evident to adults. Piaget's study led him to believe that a child's mind develops through a series of stages, in an upward march from newborn simple reflexes to the adult abstract reasoning power. Thus, an 8-year-old can comprehend things a toddler cannot, such as the analogy that getting an idea is like a light turn on in your head, or the miniature slide is too small for sliding and a miniature car is much too small to get into. Piaget's core ideas is that driving force behind our intellectual progression is an unceasing struggle to make sense of our experiences. To this end, the maturing brain builds schemas. Schema is a conceptual or mental mold into which we pour our experiences. By adulthood, we have built countless schemas, ranging from cats and dogs to our concept of love. To explain how we use and adjust our schemas, Piaget proposed 2 more concepts. First, that we assimilate new experiences. We interpret them in terms of things that we already understand, our current understandings. Having a simple schema for dog, for example, a toddler may call all four-legged animals dogs for a while, but as we interact with the world, we adjust or accommodate, which is another vocab word. We accommodate by taking in new information into our schemas, incorporating information provided by new experiences. Thus, the child soon learns that the original dog schema is too broad and accommodates by refining the category into either another schema or a better understanding. So Piaget's theory around current thinking is that through experience, we pour things into mental molds and assimilate and accommodate, and that's how, in part, we learn. Piaget further believed that children construct their understanding of the world while interacting with it. Their minds experience spurts of change followed by a greater stability as they move from one cognitive plateau to the next, each with really distinctive characteristics that permit specific kinds of thinking. Piaget's view included cognitive development in 4 major stages. The first was sensoromotor. That's the one we're going to talk about first. Then comes pre-operational, then concrete operational, and finally formal operational. So what is the sensoromotor stage all about? In the sensoromotor stage, which lasts from birth to about 2 years old, babies take in the world through their senses and through their actions. They look, they hear, they touch, they mouth, they grasp, and as their hands and limbs begin to move, they begin to make things happen, and through that, they develop information. They learn to understand the world. Very young babies seem to live in the present. Out of sight is out of mind. For example, they don't understand object permanence. If somebody that they care about leaves the room, oftentimes that elicits crying because they don't understand that that person can exist outside of their realm of experience. So they cease to exist in some ways when they leave their their sight. And so when they can't perceive them, they don't understand that that person still exists somewhere out there. So object permanence is something that they move through in this stage. By the end of the stage and movement into the next, they should understand that when their mom goes away, that she is probably coming back. Okay. Okay, there are other things that develop during this stage, but object permanence is one of the biggies. Scale errors, where kids don't understand that they don't fit into particular things. They don't have a sense of themselves. You can read the baby physics piece in the reading by yourself, but the baby math I'll explain quickly. So Karen Wynn showed 5-month-olds 1 or 2 objects. Then she hid the objects behind a screen and visibly removed or added one. When she lifted the screen, the infant sometimes did a double take, staring longer when shown a wrong number of objects. But were they just responding to a greater or smaller mass of objects rather than a change in number? Later experiments showed that baby's number sense extends to larger numbers, to ratios, and to such things as drum beats and motions. If accustomed to Daffy Duck puppet jumping 3 times on the stage, they showed surprise if it only jumped twice. So clearly babies and infants are smarter than Piaget appreciated. They have a lot on their minds. According to Piaget, the pre-operational stage lasts from about 2 years old to around 6 or 7 years old. In the pre-operational stage, children are too young to perform kind of mental operations, like imagining an action or mentally reversing an action. For a 5-year-old, imagining that a glass of milk seems like too much to drink in a tall and narrow glass may think it's perfectly acceptable if the amount is poured into a short, wide glass, focusing only on the height and the dimension. The child can't perform the operation of mentally pouring the milk back, so mentally. Before the age of about 6, said Piaget, children lack the concept of conservation, this whole principle that the quantity remains the same despite changing its shape. You guys have probably either experienced or yourself have been really concerned with like equity and fairness. You know that's all, kids are all about that. During the pre-operational stage, it's also a time of egocentrism. Piaget contended that preschool children are really egocentric. They have difficulty perceiving things from another person's point of view. So asking them things like, how do you think that makes someone else feel? That would be a difficult way for you to manage kids' behavior if they were still in a pre-operational stage. Different types of tactics for teaching their behavior changes would be more appropriate there. Preschoolers, although still egocentric, develop an ability as time goes by to infer others' mental states when they begin forming a theory of mind, a term first coined by psychologists to describe chimpanzees' seeming ability to read intentions. Infants as young as 7 months show some knowledge of what others' beliefs. With time, the ability to take another's perspective is beginning to develop. They come to understand what made a playmate angry, when a sibling will share, what might make a parent buy a toy, and they begin to tease, empathize, and try to persuade. All are part of the theory of mind developing. The third stage, according to Piaget, is the concrete operational stage. By age 6 or 7, said Piaget, children enter the concrete operational stage. Given concrete physical materials, they begin to grasp and understand conservation. They understand that changes in form don't necessarily mean change in quantity. They can mentally kind of pour milk back and forth between glasses in different shapes. They also enjoy jokes that use new understanding. Piaget believed that during the concrete operational stage, children became able to comprehend mathematical transformations. So, for example, when Laura was 6, I was astonished at her inability to reverse simple arithmetic. Asked what is 8 plus 4, she required 5 seconds to compute 12, and then another 5 seconds to then compute 12 minus 4. By age 8, she could reverse fairly instantly. Okay, finally, the last stage is the formal operational stage. So according to Piaget, the formal operational stage happens sometime around 12 years old. Our reasoning expands from purely concrete, involving actual experience, to encompass abstract thinking, involving imagined realities and symbols. As children approach adolescence, Piaget thinks, many become capable of thinking more like scientists. They can ponder hypothetical propositions. They can deduce consequences. If this, then that. Systematic reasoning, what Piaget calls formal operational thinking, is now within their grasp. Although full-blown logic and reasoning have to wait a little while, the rudiments of formal operational thinking begin. Consider this problem, for example. If John is in school, then Mary is in school. John is in school. What can be said about Mary? So formal operational thinkers have no trouble answering that correctly, but neither do most 7-year-olds. The 4 stages in chart form, in case that helps you a little bit. Pause here for a moment. A Russian psychologist, Lev Vygotsky, has an alternate theory that critiques Piaget's. Where Piaget emphasized how a child's mind grows through interaction with a physical environment, Vygotsky emphasized how a child's mind grows through interaction with a social environment. If Piaget's child was a young scientist, Vygotsky's was a young apprentice. By mentoring children and giving them new words, parents and others provide a temporary scaffold from which children can step to higher levels of thinking. Language, an important ingredient of social mentoring, provides the building blocks for thinking, noted Vygotsky. Effective mentoring occurs when children are developmentally ready to learn a new skill. For Vygotsky, a child's zone of proximal development was the zone between what a child can and can't do. It's what a child can do with help. When learning to ride a bike, its developmental zone in which a child can ride with training wheels or a steadying parent hand is an example of that. please read Piaget and Vygotsky read.